We are from a variety of different artistic and creative backgrounds, which may bring up the question of, like, why don't you have a tech person up here talking about AI? We understand. But we are really excited to talk about this topic, which I believe everybody is affected by in their own field and realm of influence. And so we're going to talk through how, as curators, as artists, as writers and creatives in this space, and frankly, as disciples, are what we're seeing, what we're navigating, and then we're going to hopefully open up the discussion to see what you're seeing as well. So we understand this is also a polarizing topic. You probably already know what you think about AI, and by the time we finish talking, it will probably have already changed, how AI even works, because it's just moving that rapidly. So we just invite everyone to remain open and curious and fascinated, and hopefully we'll have a really rich discussion about some of the cultural and aesthetic implications of this technology in the field of Latter-day Saint and devotional Christian artwork. So first, we're just going to kind of talk through what is AI as a technology, how does it work briefly, and what are some different metaphors or ways of understanding it to help us kind of get our heads around what we're even talking about here. So.
All right, we admitted already, none of us are technology specialists, but I am a creative writer, and so I go down like a lot of research rabbit holes. And about 20 years, I was working on a story where chatbots were important, and so I looked at what's that technology, and a lot has changed. But to recap, one of the original chatbots from the 1960s was named Eliza, a name that Latter-day Saints can get behind. And she was designed as kind of a counselor. So the way the program worked was you would say something, the program had kind of lists of keywords to say what general area is this, and it would give kind of generic, almost fortune cookie therapy back, right? And maybe ask a question that wanted you to think more deeply. So it was like the kind of therapist who just gets you to think. And that was Eliza. And she did okay unless she read the, prompt wrong and said something wildly inappropriate. But, what therapist hasn't once in a while? When I was studying chatbot technology, it was a new day because with the internet, there was all this language just out there written down that was much more informal and conversational. And so they thought, maybe we can teach computers to talk, a program to talk, by having it look at what people say and just predict what comes next, kind of on a word-to-word, sentence-to-sentence level. And sometimes you'd get coherent responses, but sometimes a conversation would take a weird left turn really suddenly. Because when you're just trying to predict the next word, there's sort of pile-on effects, right? And it says this, and suddenly that word reminds it of this stream of speaking, and it's got a totally different voice and personality, and there's no continuity. So you could have response, but not continuity. The big breakthrough in the past decade was they said, what if we reprogram things so that instead of using the last word to predict the next word, we also let the next word predict the last word. That sounds crazy. But take the example of computer translation. If I say, I'm going to the store and I'm going to have breakfast tomorrow, in most languages, those are two totally different words, right? Is going physical or is that future tense? If you can change the beginning based on the end, then suddenly you can produce a more accurate translation, right? And scale that up, these large language models or visually large pattern models have been a huge leap forward in the ability of a program to use kind of probability to make really good guesses about when you ask about this topic, what's sort of the average thing people say. And so we have great probability machines that do well at translation in language. If you haven't tried it yet, like in a live Zoom meeting, it's fantastic. And there's other use cases they're really good at. I don't, though, and the thing we wanted to talk about for the first conversation portion is I don't love calling it artificial intelligence because of the way I think about intelligence. If I am a pattern recognizing and regurgitating machine made of meat, then like that is artificial intelligence and it can do what I do. Religiously, I don't accept that, right? I believe in things like human will and intention. And so to me, we shouldn't think of this, the metaphor screws people up when they try to say, how do I use this program instead of a person, rather than saying, how does this interact with a human creator? So what metaphor would you use in place of AI to say what this is?
I think I've come to see it as a tool. It's neither bad or good. It's something that can move us in either direction.
Yeah, and for me, I think I like thinking about it more of a mirror. I'm really fascinated by the way that we're prompt engineering and expressing desires, and it's guessing, and then we get to reflect on that and think, well, is that what we wanted or is it not what we wanted? And if it's different, like that tells us something about ourselves.
Yeah, and I love both of those, the idea that we can extend as a tool and interact, and that we can learn something from what AI gives us about the larger conversation being averaged. When we're talking about generative AI that creates what kind of artistic tool is, I think it's a blender. You're taking visual culture or language culture, tossing it in a blender and turning it around. I love a good smoothie. And so sometimes I think that works. My father-in-law had throat surgery once and tried blended steak. He would not recommend this to anyone. So one thing I hope we can kind of work out in this conversation is, what's the difference? How do you get smoothie and not blended steak as like our future?
So let's think now of like, what are some interesting usages that we've seen? And I'd be interested too, like in our Q&A, to see if others have ideas as well of AI or this tool or this mirror or this blender.
I think I like uses best that are playing with human intention. So I've got a friend who has a Dungeons and Dragons group, and they said, let's make an AI image of us, our characters. So they described it. And then they went, no, we're more like this. And he's actually the dungeon master, and you can kind of watch him go from the background to slowly appearing more and more prominent, the way they describe themselves, and everybody changing. And I think that's a cool, like there's human connection happening there with the tool.
Yeah, one example that came up when I was having a discussion about this on my Instagram was I was specifically discussing its usage in religious context and how I have a lot of kind of confusion and discomfort about that, but I'm open to the idea that maybe there's good usages. And something someone brought up was as a woman who had an albino daughter, and she wanted an image of her daughter with Christ. And as a professional artist, that's a very hyper-specific image, and I don't know that I would ever spend time making something quite that hyper-specific, but I know it'd be very meaningful for that child. And so the fact that she had a tool where she could then create an image that taught her child something about their self-worth and their relationship to Christ, I think could be very meaningful.
And similarly, I've seen examples across faith traditions of people using AI to liken the scriptures better to themselves, to imagine things beyond sort of what they can construct in their inner eye of, scripture stories, and thinking of, using the AI technology. I mean, that word prompting that we're so used to using in a Latter-day Saint discourse when we talk about the Spirit, like it's actually really interesting to think about that working as like prompt engineers with these AI engines, and how that can be sort of a or collaborative experience that the AI actually can prompt you in addition to you prompting it.
So all that being said, we also recognize there's a lot of very weighty concerns surrounding the usage and the advent of AI in modern industry. And we don't really have time or necessarily the expertise to dive into the environmental issues, the ethical and legal issues. So we really wanted to focus a lot on the aesthetic issues, because that's where we can speak to from our personal and professional experience. So how do we think about this as an aesthetic part of our day-to-day experience and our religious practice?
So for me, I mean, immediately what my mind goes to as a scholar and an art historian is thinking about cultural theory. And Walter Benjamin in 1935, he's a really important Jewish German cultural theorist You can think about this timeline 110 years later. What world is he living in? At the end of a world, as Zach said this morning, and here we are today. And he's thinking about similar concerns as he's engaging with Marxism and all kinds of things that I think are still more pertinent than ever. So he writes this essay in 1935 called "The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction." And so he's thinking about AI as like another technological intervention, like the book or the press or the photograph that destabilizes, but ultimately we've seen historically does not replace the original art image or art object. But with AI, I think the part that feels new to us is we can't catch up to it. The growth is so rapid and exponential. It's saturating our visual material culture to a degree that we've yet been able to anticipate. And the other thing that I think is fascinating about this to me as an art historian is that artificial intelligence, because it's not human, has the potential to get us closer to a perfect image. Now, we still can't get full wine glasses or five-fingered hands, so I don't know how close we are to that, but there is that potential there, that because it's automated, perfection might be attainable in a way that it isn't because of our own human limitations. And so Benjamin says, again in 1935, even the most perfect reproduction of a work of art is lacking in one element: its presence in time and space, its unique existence at the place where it happens to be. So he's concerned with, as I think are we, this idea of the original and the authentic presence that an art object has in time and space. And so he talks about this idea, the term he uses often in this essay is aura. And so he's thinking about the way that original or natural art objects have aura, and defines that as a unique phenomenon of distance. So the closer we are to the art object, the closer we are to something real. There's something authentic about it. And so he outlines this paradox where he writes, "The desire of contemporary masses to bring things closer spatially and humanely is just as ardent as their bent towards overcoming the uniqueness of every reality by accepting its reproduction." So reproduction takes us away from the original art object, but in a way it also brings us closer to it, because it might be the first encounter that we have with seeing that work itself. So we always want to be close to the real, but we're also willing and ready to accept a reproduction of it. And I think Benjamin's ideas are really fun to play with here for a couple of reasons, and I'm going to take a lot of license. But one, I think we can think about Jesus for Latter-day Saints as the original. And we always want Jesus to be close, right? That's what this path of discipleship is all about for us, but we have to rely on artistic reproductions of him to imagine that visually. And then two, we have some pretty bold truth claims, and most faith traditions do, but ours specifically, that hinge on the reality of a living, embodied Savior. And we also place a premium on knowledge versus belief, and all of which influences our community's preferences for illustrative and narrative depictions of deity. So we insist on the corporeal reality of Jesus and expect our art and our artists to prove this. So all of this is already happening, and we're being negotiated. And AI is sort of amplifying this because it throws in another element, which is a concern for authorship.
Yeah, I like that you went back to Benjamin and this concern about what is the original, what is presence, what does it mean to have something that's like ideal or perfect versus something distinct. I think I want my Jesus with the scars, right? Yeah. I want him with the holes. I don't want him to be perfect because then I know it's him. There's that connection. Esther had asked, as we're planning, like, what are your aesthetic fears if AI takes over? And I said, with apologies to Harriman, which is a suburb in the south part of Salt Lake County, that I drove through streets and streets of houses that were different shades of the same brown and probably designed by the same firm in like 3 variations. That's what I'm scared of. I'm scared of Harriman being our future. There is a reason why it is more fun to walk through like Florence and people go there and people don't fly to Harriman. I'm sorry, whichever Harriman people I offended. But there's a reason for that, right? And I think the reason is human attention per square inch, human mistakes and idiosyncrasy per square inch that gives a texture to reality, and somehow that draws us in. And so we can make a lot of art really quickly now. I don't know if we're making art that will stand the test of time, right? And that's not new with AI, because like when I go to Manti Temple, I brought my kids to the open house there, it drew them in, right? There's all this attention that went into building those pioneer era temples, and my kids can feel that, and more attention comes out. In newer temples, which are still beautiful and still sacred, their attention slides off a little more because it was made in an age of mechanical reproduction, right? So my aesthetic concern is we make stuff so frictionless that we don't even register, and that we miss the time to build something that endures across time. And theologically, as Latter-day Saints, who feel like we're building sociality and connection, and that happens when you invest attention, and I can't help but have attention drawn back, we're failing to make art for eternity when we make low human attention art. So that's the aesthetic thing I'm worried about. And you can see it, you can feel it. It's not just, I know that free will is my belief. I can't prove that free will exists, but I can prove that Florence is more fun to walk down. So, Esther.
The thing I thought about, since I spend pretty much all day, every day, either working professionally as an artist or working with other artists who are working professionally, is the character development that comes from that process. And as I was thinking about a good parallel that might translate for those of you who maybe aren't immersed in the art world, I think about it this way. We have esports, but that hasn't changed the draw of the Super Bowl. We have motorboats, but that doesn't mean that we don't still do rowing in the Olympics. There's something about watching that process of mind over matter, of the hours and days and weeks and years that it takes to hone a physical craft that is meaningful for us as human beings and for us as a community. And I worry that if we jump immediately to things that don't require that sort of exercise, that we're missing out on developing that in ourselves and providing examples of that we can point to in our communities.
All right, now it gets real.
Okay, now onto the juicy stuff. So a lot of this has kind of stemmed out of ongoing conversations that we've all had in our various spheres around the absolute proliferation of AI images of Jesus. And some of these are ones you've probably seen around. They've been wildly popular over the last year and a half. You've probably seen them in your chapels. Maybe you have some in your home. This is not a shame if you do. This is a complex conversation we're trying to have here. And it's just this sheer saturation we're seeing in the market without what I feel like is some necessary levels of reflection of what this means for us culturally and what this means for us individually and spiritually. So we're going to talk a little bit about, what does this mean? What is it saying about us as a community and us as individuals?
Yeah, so again, I go back to the mirror, and now that we are looking at images together, again, just anticipating what it thinks we want when we put a prompt in. And Esther, maybe you can, what was the prompt for this one again?
Oh, these are just some popular ones. These are ones that are sold in
ones
stores.
That are doing, that are performing, right? Yeah. But I think that's interesting. Like, as a museum curator, you're not going to be surprised to hear that I'm not going to put this on the wall at the MOA. But I am still fascinated by why these are popular. Like, this is still doing something for somebody, and I want to know what that is. And my, my approach would be to become an algorithm myself and say, well, if you like that, you might like this other image that's our Rembrandt head of Christ. That's so amazing. So that's what's fascinating about this to me is what this is reflecting back to us about our expectations of Christianity and specifically of images of Jesus Christ.
Something I've thought about, because it's really easy for me to jump to the negative. And but as we were having this conversation of what does it say? That this is what's coming out of the woodwork in essence, and this is what people are buying in massive amounts in the current moment. And I think a positive spin on it is that we are seeking a gospel of grace. And even though for me as a fine artist, sometimes it feels kitsch, it feels cheap, but I have to stop myself. I can be a snob. I recognize that. It's my job to be a snob. And But what is this saying about the everyday experiences of Christians and Latter-day Saints and what they're hungering for in their spiritual experiences? And I think it speaks to a Christ that's approachable, a gospel that offers us joy, a gospel that offers us the space to celebrate. And I think that's something worth reflecting on.
And another thing, going back to this mirror analogy that AI is doing, and again, for good or for ill, is amplifying bias, which I think is the most valuable takeaway that we could have as part of this conversation is, do we like what it's sending back? If we don't, like, what are we going to do to change and shape that? And so for me, like, one thing I notice is just this flattening of Christ's character. And again, like, there's just not the depth or nuance that I see in the expression, but I still find that fascinating. Like, if a smiling Jesus, for example, is still doing something for somebody, then I wonder what that might be and how, as a curator, I could heighten that a little bit more or draw that out in the experience of visitors to my museum.
Yeah, totally. So I'm going to run you through a little experiment I did. So this was just going to Midjourney and typing in painting of Jesus. And this was the first 4 things it spit out. So I was like, okay, let's get a little more specific and see what it's telling us about our visual culture as Latter-day Saints. And so I asked it to make a Latter-day Saint painting of Jesus. And then it's like, okay, that's somewhat of a new cultural thing to label ourselves as Latter-day Saints, so we'll go for a Mormon Jesus. And that's what we ended up with in the end here. And, it's funny, we laugh at it, but there's a lot that this invites us to reflect, that those are the 8 images that it initially says, this is what Jesus looks like and is to you as a culture, based on the thousands and thousands of images that I, as a large language learning model, have crunched. And for me, something that I think and talk a lot about is how it's limiting our cultural perspectives of Jesus, our racial perspectives of Jesus, what it's telling us about what we prioritize and what we see as holiness, and what messages that might be sharing with other people, especially as we become an increasingly global church.
Yeah. I'm just going to refer you. I wrote an essay called Why I Hate White Jesus. Which I will refer you to. You can Google James Goldberg, Why I Hate White Jesus. Hopefully if you Google James Goldberg, you don't get Google saying, why does he hate Jesus? You never know with language models these days. But I think there's real stakes to this, right? When people internalize that image and don't think about it, there's stuff that happens. I used to model for biblical painters a lot. Karma DeYoung Anderson just sort of dragged me around when I showed up in Utah. She ran into me in a grocery store and was like, stop, and would just take me to painters. And sometimes I had really good experiences.
Painters prowl at grocery stores. I will warn you. I've 100% done that.
I fell prey. I was young and new to this place. I didn't know how many religious painters per square mile I was up against. So some really good experiences, right? As people are trying to imagine and put Jesus in things. I did have one experience where I'm modeling, and I was Simon of Cyrene, carrying the cross for the most Norwegian Jesus you have ever seen. And that's impressive, because you've seen some very Norwegian Jesuses. And the whole time, he's joking with the painter about, you should paint Jesus and Osama. And it's just not funny, right? I saw people get shot after 9/11 for looking like me. And Jesus probably did. So I think it does matter what Jesus looks like racially. I think the different ways gender has played out with Jesus are interesting. If you were to Google medieval Catholic Jesus, you'd get one kind of look, right, of kind of an elongated Jesus who's walked a lot. Sometimes has this kind of effeminate thing going because people wanted that nurturing Jesus. Starting a little over a century ago, Jesus got really ripped in the United States about the same time the YMCA opened. And that's not a coincidence, right? American Christianity went through this muscular Christianity period where they said, we got to attract men back, and Jesus is going to be tough, and he could build you a log cabin. And that's fine, but that's about us. That's not about him. All right, and this to me is the fundamental concern with this amplifier of bias. The problem with using a probability machine as a worship aid is that we do this already, right?
Yep.
We worship, we are very proud of being Christians, and we make Jesus our mascot of whatever we believe in our country's Christianity at the moment and whatever we value. And we project that onto him. And I don't want a mascot, I want a master, right? I want art that calls into questions my assumption about Jesus, right? And makes me think about him again so I can go and I can encounter the real Jesus who's still there, who's going to make demands of me and draw me out of myself and away from the center of an algorithm. And that's what I want out of Jesus art. All right. I think it's my turn to ask a question. Oh, yes. Maddie, you're a
Yes,
curator. And Esther, you're a gallerist. What are you doing in religious art right now? And what is that doing for people who could be making their own generative images of Jesus at home instead of coming to a museum or a gallery? So, in other words, justify your professional existence.
Used to doing it, so.
Excellent, go for it.
To my parents mostly. Used to doing it. No, so I mean, I appreciate this question because I get to kind of plug some of the work that I'm doing at the Museum of Art at BYU. Wonderful space in a really rich art landscape that we have in Utah here. We're very lucky. But I am curating a show called Earthbound and Heavenward, the Sacred Art of Discipleship, which sort of relies on a low Christology. And so we're looking at the way that artists have emphasized the humanity of Jesus and also the divinity of humanity. So the followers of Jesus, the disciples that are walking that path, very grounded, with this ultimate goal of ascent that only happens through Christ's condescension. So there's a really beautiful sort of reversal that's happening in that show. And the artists are evidence for those sorts of arguments that I'm making theologically in that space. And some of the works in the show, and I've followed a model that my predecessor, Ashley Whitaker, also did, which is to juxtapose traditional historical artworks next to contemporary artists. That makes them a little bit more accessible. I think the thematic dialogue and conversations are more interesting. And so there's a lot of contemporary artists in this show, and it's also given me a lot of excuse to buy new works for our collection and sort of shape the collection, it's so fun to spend money that's not yours on art. So fun, best part of my job. But we've acquired a couple new works and then are loaning one of Amelia Wing's works, and I just have them here on the left. You can see Amelia's Nazareth, which is an aerial view painting with a gold leaf. It's very sort of abstract, but quickly you can see that that's a map. It's cartographic in its nature. And so she's doing really beautiful things with thinking through the humanity of Jesus in the sense of place, and that this is Jesus of Nazareth from a location that is still in existence today. And then we have J. Kirk Richards' piece in the middle, which is called Rescue. This is a larger work that Kirk has actually used soil from his yard, and you can see it like in person, and grass bits at the bottom of this painting to really drive home that there's this amazing sense of flight you get anyways from this digital reproduction, but in person you feel like this angel figure is kicking up the dust as they are ascending with this really beautiful child in their arms. And then on the far right, you have Elise Whaley's work Through a Corridor of Laurel, which shout out to Esther, who let me know about Elise's work at her gallery. We purchased this from Compass, and we're very happy to have it, which is an intricately patterned work of pressed plants with acrylic paint on top as well. And so I bring these three works forward in this conversation, not just because I love them and I'm excited to debut them in this show, and I hope you all can come see them, but because there is a material, irreplaceable nature to them that can only be appreciated in person. That said, Wayfare has reproduced these works and works by these artists in its publication, and that is also how I found out about them, some of them. And so again, I don't love the binary of, well, it's either or, we have to choose. This is just how it is. But we are still always going to crave those in-person experiences in museum spaces. And there are artworks that are very aware that there's going to be a viewer in person. And so they're doing really amazing things, just gifts they're giving to you that if you come and stand a moment in front of them, you are the beneficiary of. So I'm very excited about this show. It opens up September. It'll be up for 3 years. So hopefully in the next, little bit, you'll be able to come and enjoy them too.
Thank you, Maddie. And it's been such a pleasure working with her. She's visionary with the things she's doing at the MOA. I was just texting Elise this morning because she'd posted on her stories about a new piece. She's like, I was up at 3 a.m. working on a new concept. It's for Restore, so you're going to see some brand new work by Elise at Restore. But she said that the MOA acquiring this space was the best thing that's ever happened to her. So high five to all involved.
Very mutual.
So I'm going to give a shameless plug for what we're doing at the Compass. And we get a little bit of a tasting menu here today, so please take some time with the art in the back to check out some of the things that we show frequently. As I was thinking about what it means to be a gallerist and what it means to be able to put these things in front of people and to give them those in-person experiences, there's a couple experiences that came to the surface for me. I think the first is I had a few different instances of this over the last few months where somebody walked into the gallery and said, if this is what church looked like, I'd come back to church. And there's so much to unpack with that comment. And again, kind of going back to like the smiling Jesus, it really makes me ask, okay, what are we doing in this space that's feeding people's souls in a way that they're not getting fed in maybe the historical or current context in which they've experienced religion? And there's always room for progress. This is not to say we've always been doing it wrong, that we're currently doing everything wrong, but to ask, what more can we do? And the beautiful thing about our church is we are a church of lay members, of lay leadership. We're not asking for constant top-down direction of what we can and should do. And art is one of those areas where you have so much room. You get to pick what you show in your Relief Society lesson. You get to pick what you put on the walls of your home, which is the most sacred space. It's where we are supposed to teach the most private and personal lessons to our families. And art is such a powerful and permanent way to do that in many ways. So to another specific story, we did a pop-up at the Roots Tech conference, and this woman came up to me and she'd taken a painting off the wall, which not good etiquette. Please don't do that. If you want a painting, come talk to me. But she'd taken it off the wall and was like standing there in front of the checkout desk hugging it. And so, I was just kind of like making small talk with her, trying to like make sure she didn't damage it as she was checking out, just kind of the like, oh, where are you visiting from? What brought you to Roots Tech? And she just kind of spills out to me and my assistant. She's like, I'm buying this painting, I'm getting emotional, because this is what it feels like to grieve my husband, who passed away last year. It's the painting on the far left there by Katie Cash Davis. And you can't replace experiences like that. So she stood there and bawled, I stood there and bawled, she walked away, we told everybody else bawled. But that's the power of that aura that you're talking about, that she stood there in front of that painting and said, this is what grief feels like, but this is what it feels like to move through that grief. And I need that experience in my home. I need my children. I need my grandchildren to have that experience as well.
We've got the scripture that the same sociality that exists among us here will exist among us there, only coupled with a glory we don't now enjoy. And that's it, right? Here's a way that an artistic creation coming from an artist is drawing something out of two people. My undergraduate degree was in theater, and I had a professor at Vaughan who told me you should not imagine theater happening on the stage. You should think about the story unfolding on the stage and what it's bringing out of you, and then the people sitting in the audience and the memories it's evoking for them. And imagine those mixing in the air above you. That's theater, right? So art is not this reproduction. This is not a pipe. To quote Renee Margaret, that's a Dada joke, I'm sorry. Right? It's not just that image. It's what that image brings out of this viewer and the memories and the fact that the art enables her to share that moment with Esther. That's sacred, right? And I think absolutely like being in in a physical space with art is nice. Being with other people in front of art. I love taking my youth group to the MOA and seeing what it brings out of them. I did want to share one quick story from that show, if we can show the next slide. If you are averaging Jesus, this does not show up, right? This is Brian Kershiznik saying, there's a Christian tradition of the harrowing of hell when Jesus, after he dies and before he's resurrected, goes to hell, the spirit world, spirit prison, and opens up. As Latter-day Saints, we love this idea. We never call it the harrowing of hell. We skip the day when you celebrate it, the day before Easter, but we love it, right? And so Brian's like, I'm going to do it. What does it feel like for Jesus to break death open, to redeem people from darkness? And he goes back to a medieval tradition of depicting hell as a monster, which Jacob would recognize. And he says, let me do it. And my kids loved, when the youth group went to the MOA where this was, seeing the teeth falling down, right? And there's these little idiosyncratic details that drew something out of them. And so, yes, I love what you're doing, and I love the way that's interacting in a space that could be increasingly genericized to our disservice. So last question, thinking about the next decade or two, which directions would you like to see our religious art develop in an era where generative AI is widely available? Tell me the future, my friends. The good one, though. Tell me the good future.
So for me, I love in the DNC the 29 when it talks about all things unto me are spiritual. And I think we like to think that, and then we're like, yeah, but there's still a spiritual and a secular, right? And that we still like to set up a binary and also assume that maybe is happening, but it looks a different way. So, I would argue that even if you create a work of art that has nothing overtly religious about it in its subject matter, or even in the practice, I think that you being who you are, which is a God in embryo, a disciple, however you want to identify yourself in your sort of faith journey, you are engaged in a spiritually creative act. That's it. And so for me, as I was looking, there have been, I was thinking through what has the advice been from the pulpit. There's a lot to artists and to creatives, and some have been more helpful than others. There is a statement that Elder Ballard made in the 1990s, actually, which I thought was very helpful. He said, God's purpose for the artist is to inspire, to give us visions of ourselves that we might not otherwise see, to make us better than we would have been. And to me, that does not mean inspiration or something spiritually strengthening does not mean that it feels good. And I don't think art's job is to make you feel good all the time. I think it can, but I think if that's your expectation of it only, then you're going to have a much more narrow scope of works that are shaping you and supporting that discipleship paradigm that you're living in. And so I love how broad this is because it lets us interpret it a little bit differently than we may have in the past. So I'm thinking about works that have been profoundly inspiring and motivating, like J. Kirk Richards again. His 7 Apologies series was really fascinating to see him work through difficult sort of pain points in church history and cultural sort of trappings of Mormonism, and come to kind of grips with that in a really amazing, peaceful, constructive way. Or I think about Marlena Wilding's work, which is inviting us to encounter and confront racism as it stands today, and the church's history with that as well. And so I still feel like that is great LDS art, but I don't know that it necessarily is what we think of or what we expect all the time. And so that's not what the AI Blender is going to be sending back to us. But oh, how we need it, right? I think about art as a conduit and a catalyst for this process of showing us the parts of ourselves that we try to hide from, the parts of ourselves that are most in need of healing and connection. So my sort of plea to artists is to please keep doing what you're doing and give us something that's real to you, real to our community. And even if the subject matter isn't religious, it's still going to be driven by the good life that you're trying to live. And as you're trying to piece this together and live in a world of opposition and figure all that out, that's going to come through, and we're going to connect with that. And then to those that are on the receiving end in a position to invest in and support the arts in our community, I would say remain open to what that can look like, and invest in those that are working to build Zion through art making and practice in the best ways that they know how.
Amen. Thank you, Maddie. I'm going to share a little anecdote. So I went to a Baptist school for graduate school, which was a really fascinating experience. And I think it was my second semester there, I brought in a religious piece that I was working on, and my professor kind of offhandedly said, "Oh, your work reminds me a lot of Howard Lyon." And then he kind of like snide aside, he's like, "Yeah, Howard does that Mormon Jesus stuff." Not realizing that I was a Latter-day Saint. And I was like, "Oh, thanks. I love Howard's work. That's a compliment to me." And then 2 weeks later, I was in Salt Lake hanging out with Howard. So I took a picture and sent it to my professor and said, "Hanging out with the Mormon Jesus guy." But that's just a small sample of the overarching and deep-seated influence that I saw of Latter-day Saint artists in the Bible Belt. And anybody who's lived in the Bible Belt, you may or may not have picked up on this. How many little tiny churches in a town in nowhere, Kentucky, have a Simon Dewey in front of them, have a Greg Olson in front of them, maybe have a Walter Rain in front of them? And I continue to see that outsized influence grow. And you even see it in the modeling of AI-generated images, that regardless if you put in the qualifier of a Latter-day Saint or a Mormon Jesus image, if you just type in Jesus, I can frequently tell you, oh, that's copying Walter Rain's painting style. That's copying Greg Olson's color palette. It's drawing vastly from Latter-day Saint modern Christian artist. And so for me, as a part of an ongoing restoration, as someone who believes that we are called to be the salt, not the flour, not, the milk or, anything else. We're called to be the salt, a little bit that goes a long way in the modern recipe of the restoration, that I have a lot of responsibility to make sure that salt has savor. And that is something I have a responsibility as an artist, but it's also something all of us have a responsibility as patrons in our own ways. However you can show up and support the arts, whether that's simply reposting it on your social media, whether that's purchasing prints, purchasing originals. We have such an opportunity to influence the world for good, and I really can't understate how much the rest of Christianity, consciously or subconsciously, looks at us in their imaginations of Jesus. And so what good can we do with that?
Yeah. Thanks, guys. Yeah.